Greetings. My name is Mehran Kamrava with the Iranian Studies Unit at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. As a women's-led social movement in Iran refuses to die down and continues to thrive, in fact, we decided to look at the dynamics of historicizing Iranian women's activism after the 1979 revolution. We are fortunate to be joined today by Dr. Shirin Saeidi, who will discuss Iranian women's activism after 1979. In this lecture, Dr. Saeidi will provide a much needed historical background to what we're witnessing on the ground today, with Iranian women leading the recent protests over the killing of Mahsa Amini by the so-called morality police. Shirin Saeidi is Assistant Professor of Political Science and also Director of the King Fahd Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Arkansas. It is important to note that she's the first female leader of the Middle East Studies program since the center's founding in the early 1990s. Dr. Saeidi has just published a terrific book called Women and the Islamic Republic: How Gendered Citizenship Conditions the Iranian State, which was published by Cambridge University Press earlier in 2002. Professor Saeidi is also the author of numerous peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. Thank you, Shirin, for joining us today as part of the Iranian Studies Unit lecture series. Before we begin, let me just mention that the audience can submit their questions through the Q&A feature of Zoom, and also by commenting on the live stream posts of the Arab Center at social media. So Shirin, over to you. I know you won't necessarily be talking about what is going on today, but you will help us have a better historical understanding of women's activism in Iran post-1979. So over to you.
Thank you, Professor Kamrava. Salam to you and to everyone who's here. Thank you for taking the time to attend. I'm very grateful. And yes, thank you for your time. I'm going to be reading my lecture, and then I look forward to engaging with everyone's questions. When I was contacted by the Arab Center many months ago, I was asked to discuss my recently published book, Women in the Islamic Republic: How Gendered Citizenship Conditions the Iranian State. Once the September 2022 protests erupted, I decided to accept an invitation to historicize non-elite women's activism, given that this is a social group whose politics I have been studying through ethnographic fieldwork since 2007. The September 2022 protests in Iran were sparked by the death in custody of Mahsa Amini. The initial protests were against mandatory hijab. The current government's refusal to, a good colleague of mine and I, argue that liberal feminism has been hegemonic in post-1979 women's rights activism. The non-elite women we see in the streets of Iran today are women that the state and women's rights movements in post-1979 failed to incorporate into their political vision. This lack of regard for non-elite women who do not fall into the liberal feminist project of advocacy, education, and other kinds of state-centric appeals becomes tangible when we make note of attempts by various national and international forces to co-opt protests. The state and other powerful forces, such as international actors, have a less central role in shaping non-elite Iranian women's desires or taming their notions of freedom. The state for women not active in women's rights movements is merely one consideration at the intersects of many others. They give equal priority to their own aspirations and the lived experiences of those around them. Now, I want to say a few sentences about how I choose to speak at this particular moment. Because transnational gender activism may be both disconnected from local objectives and cause serious harm to activists living inside Iran, I refuse to categorize or label the women leading these protests or predict their aspirations, which is generally good research practice, I believe, for a scholar. I do so because based on years of research on this particular social group, I know how much they dislike categories, labels, borders, boundaries, and academic jargon. I know that Iran as a field of study that many of us love and do not see as entirely oppressive gains its traction and beauty from the real-time labor, sacrifice, and steadfastness of non-elite people who are also the most unprotected citizens of Iran. For these reasons, I consider my lecture today to be a practice in holding space for us to remember the limits of our knowledge and vocabulary, space for us to observe and listen to what the very young women of Iran are teaching us, a space for grief that needs not be filled with words, but instead integrated as a kind of knowing into our bodies for us to remember as we encounter one another anew. In what follows, I suggest that the September 2022 protests in Iran evolved from a history of non-elite women's acts of citizenship that have consistently challenged the post-revolutionary state. The non-elite women that participate in these protests are neither supporters of imperial feminism abroad, which for me includes not only actors, individuals, or institutions that claim to be leading the protest, but it also includes perhaps well-meaning journalists and scholars who don't speak Persian, don't travel to the country, but that doesn't stop them, unfortunately, from labeling and categorizing and theorizing what is happening on the streets. So these young women and men in the streets are not an extension of imperial feminism, as the leaders in Iran might suggest, or the opposition abroad, nor are they extensions of inhumane policies led by the United States towards Iran or other parts of the region. Instead, I offer another narrative that centers on the spatial and political ramifications of codified legal inequality and gender discrimination. The Islamic Republic's legal structures, suppression of dissent, especially with regard to women's rights, forges what Paula Rivietti and I argue in a forthcoming article to be informal feminist spaces for activism. These are the spaces that most non-elite women rely on for their everyday needs and survival, although it is still organized women's rights movements and the state's gender policies that continue to attract the attention of scholars. These are spaces where women's rights struggles are suppressed, but feminist activism emerges nevertheless. For instance, leftist political prisoners during the 1980s refused to wear the chador while in prison. They succeeded in pushing back on the state's effort at controlling their bodies, even from behind bars. And another illustration of informal spaces for feminist activism, Islamist women protested on war fronts when male soldiers tried to stop them from defending their homes in southern Iran. Much like today, they were supported by men in their community and even by some military and political elites. As Catherine Somme states in her wonderful new book, which I highly recommend, Access of Hope, women's equality has become a part of national discussion about what constitutes a just state in a good society. So in order to, clarify what informal spaces of activism, feminist activism looks like, I'm going to give some examples from my field work. I visited a women's dormitory at the University of Tehran in the spring of 2013 to carry out interviews for my book. I arrived late in the evening, unaware that I would not be allowed to leave the dormitory after 10 p.m. because no woman can exit the premises after that time including a professor. To leave, I had to get permission from the head of the dormitory, who happened to be present that evening due to a conflict that had taken place. I found her in an auditorium filled with angry female students. Along with the male director of the University of Tehran's security forces, Hirasat, she stood front and center. The female students claimed that a few hours earlier, 4 men had taken drugs, climbed over the fence, and chased down a female student. The student began to scream and had a severe panic attack. She suffered an injury causing her leg to bleed, and she was given anxiety medication at the hospital. Female students told me that this was the 4th or 5th time that men had invaded the girls' dormitory. Others mentioned that in reality, a female student was caught with her boyfriend and fabricated the story to avoid disciplinary measures. At any rate, female students had gathered at the scene and refused to return to their rooms until the head of security met with them. All the female students in the auditorium were shouting, but 2 had microphones and they were directing their complaints to the head of security. I recognized both as Hezbollah affiliates that I had met and interacted with at several cultural institutes. So these are cultural institutes that promote the state's Islamization projects within society. One of the students holding the microphone stated, "We are sick and tired of being treated like children and lied to. The university should either provide better protection for us all or tell us not to leave our homes in Shahristan. You are only here having this meeting because you are afraid of unrest, shurish. You will do absolutely nothing about this problem again, as you have ignored it in the past." In this instance, then, the female Hezbollah affiliate understood public performances of religious piety to include forms of morality that escaped the state's security preferences, but which coincided with the sensibilities of others in Iranian society. Just lost my, sorry. My PDF, okay. I witnessed similar performances during field work and during my time at the university. In the fall of 2012, I attended a conference at the sociology faculty of the University of Tehran, which was discussing the gender quota system that barred women from many fields and was aggressively pursued after 2009. In the summer of 2012, it was announced that some 36 universities in Iran were barring women from 77 fields of study. Women's entrance into the university has been on the rise since 1998, reaching a peak in 2008 when women made up 66% of entering classes. The gender quotas in some instances barred women from fields of study understood to be too masculine, such as the oil industry. In other cases, such as the University of Tehran, the 50-50 gender quota was applied, as had been the norm since the 1980s, for disciplines such as philosophy. The motivation behind the quotas was to protect men's prospects for securing jobs and pursuing marriage in a context where women had more of a presence in universities. While we sat in an auditorium filled with several hundred students, one woman stood up and spoke most eloquently. She argued that although she had passed the national entrance exam with high marks and was accepted into a difficult field of research, she was ultimately not given permission to enter the program that year. She argued that this was unfair to her and many women in her position. I had met the young woman several times at another Hezbollah Cultural Institute, and had even interviewed her. Although she expressed her enthusiasm to participate in cultural projects having to do with Islamization of women's rights during our group interviews, she clarified before other female Hezbollah cultural activists that that she was not convinced by the state's moral argument regarding gender rights. She discussed how, for instance, she had to endure her father's frustration for attending activities at Hezbollah cultural institutes. She discussed how stressed she was that her brother-in-law had prevented her sister from pursuing a PhD. Her father and brother-in-law were both clergymen and generally opposed women's presence in the public sphere. In their Islamization efforts, some affiliates give those who embody the ritualistic and symbolic components of religion more political space than others. Nevertheless, developing a normative standard for university administration does not prevent Hezbollah affiliates from pushing the boundaries of autonomy and equality in other spaces of the education system. The university dormitory, the lecture hall, spaces where feminist politics is formally not welcomed by the state. But these are also spaces that can spatially transform into informal spaces for feminist activism with a single spark. And I really emphasize the single spark here. Moreover, while prior to 2009, we witnessed solidarity within groups, following the contested 2009 presidential election, we can notice solidarity between social groups around issues pertaining to women's physical security and autonomy. So I want to highlight this intergenerational and intercommunal shift with a quote from a Hezbollah woman discussing women's rights in a 2006 special issue journal dedicated to remembering Marzieh Dabbagh. Marzieh Dabbagh was an Islamist revolutionary close to Ayatollah Khomeini, who later served the state in various formal capacities, including as a member of parliament. Again, this journal was not a space where feminist politics could formally be addressed, but it did transform into an informal feminist space for activism. This young woman's words also highlight how liberal feminism is not only a bottom-up project, but that can be found in organized women's rights struggles, but it has also been one of the state's main tactics for control and manipulation of women. And this is especially so if you pay attention to the National Broadcasting Network, Sido Sima. So these are the words of the young woman. The ideal woman embodies education, marriage, motherhood, and social activism in excellence. In turn, this is what is expected of other women. Women are forced to annihilate themselves and take on a strange form to fit this model. We want this ideal, even if it meant destroying her inner identity, character, and capacities. Creating one model for everyone meant that we overlooked an important reality. Women's abilities, capacities, and the conditions of their lives vary. Therefore, there is a problem with this description. The woman that cannot become a mother feels empty. The girl that is unmarried is discouraged. The mother that did not continue her education sees herself as incomplete and useless. Very few women can actually fit into this model. We were critical of feminism because of its universal description of women, yet unintentionally we are taking steps in the same path. The perspective that can move us closer to our vision is one void of a stable and homogeneous model of a revolutionary woman. We have to accept that the presence of all these qualities in one woman is unlikely. Where it is possible, the presence of this woman will also entail some challenging conditions. We need a vision where Hazrat Zahra and Hazrat Zainab are understood as ideal and complete women. We have to try to emulate them. We have to accept that the ideal woman is not human. She does not exist. The revolutionary woman is not a character, it's a spectrum. An excellent example of someone at one end of this spectrum is Miss Dabbagh. At the other end of this continuum, there are hundreds of women that fall within this range, despite all of the specific conditions of their lives. Being present on this scale without any hierarchy or ranking is praiseworthy. Towards the end of the essay, she states the following when discussing women who do volunteer and perform community work in post-revolutionary Iran. It is possible, she says, that their hijab is not proper, but this does not lessen the value of what they are doing. With all of their limitations and merits, they are still an illustration of a revolutionary woman. Even if they cannot decipher their own identity and do not define their activism as a form of service connected to the state or society, they are still revolutionary women. I wanted to share this long quote because I think the way the term revolutionary is being used is perhaps different than what we're hearing in the mainstream media. And it poses, I think, a lot of questions as we continue to think about the future of these protests. So these women that I just mentioned, these women coming from a religious background and pro-regime background, are not alone in their acts of citizenship, but they build on the labor of secular leftist and Islamist women during the first decade of the establishment of an Islamic Republic in Iran. I will now share some examples of acts of citizenship from prison cells in the 1980s to the war fronts of the Iran-Iraq War. Regardless of whether the state decided to use children as a tactic for control or if they were imprisoned merely because of their parents' circumstances, the presence of children in prison wards influenced women's resistance. During our 2008 conversations in Germany, Maryam Nouri emphasizes how seeing children in prison empowered her to continue her resistance. As she exited the hospital without her family or husband nearby, she sensed her nation's solidarity as people shouted at the Revolutionary Guardsmen who had forced her to carry her own luggage and a newborn only a few hours after giving birth. The visual display of solidarity from strangers inspired her to transcend the isolation of prison life and resist the establishment of an Islamic Republic in Iran. She began to define herself as Sarmoze, or someone that intended to continue resisting the Islamic Republic from behind bars. Shortly after her son was born and they returned to prison, officials offered Nouri's son baby food, but suddenly discontinued serving meals especially made for all other children in the ward. Cherishing the solidarity she felt from her nation months earlier, Maryam Nouri refused food for her baby, arguing either all the babies get food or mine will not have any either. By imagining the authoritarian nature of the state and its effects on Iranian society, she could deprive her child in exchange for an alternative political order. Multiple extensions of her body cross spheres took place for this decision to be formulated. Reconceiving her positionality within an imagined polity meant that the state could not manipulate her identity as a mother to construct a subject for its rule. Her identity as a mother embedded within a nation permitted her to take a moral stance against the living condition for babies in prison with their mothers. In another illustration from the 1980s, it was not acceptable for Iranian women to live away from their parents prior to marriage. Sahame Taqati stayed and volunteered in hospitals even though her family had left Khorramshahr. Once Khorramshahr was liberated in 1982, she decided to live in Ahvaz, which was still under attack, to complete her high school diploma. When her father asked her to stay at a family friend's home in Ahvaz, she refused. Her father finally accepted her decision and said, "Stay wherever you like, just make sure you continue your education." She rented a home with a few girlfriends and achieved her high school diploma in Ahvaz while her parents lived in Qom. A female high school student having this level of independence in Iran during the 1980s is astonishing. With the male protector absent both from from her warfront and adolescent experiences during the war, an underlying belief in gender equality on behalf of father and daughter seeps through the story. It suggests that the oppositional construct of the genders was unsettled as young girls and women decided to take part in defending their city. The unconventional collaboration seen on the part of Saham's father illustrates that the male protector discourse became less compelling for Khuzestani families whose relatives were active in the war front as fighters or merely residents of a region under siege. In conclusion, what non-elite women's experiences with acts of citizenship show us is that informal spaces for feminist activism requires a critique of liberal feminism with an eye on the normative morality embedded in institutions. Lobbying, negotiating, mentoring, and advocacy work not only fail to serve the poor, these tactics for change can also backfire. Acts of citizenship among non-elite women have rarely included intentions to engage directly with the state. What my book shows is that acts of citizenship emerging in informal spaces are not state-centric, linear, or necessarily even forward-thinking. These acts are about taking what one believes they are owed in a context where civil society is suppressed and the possibility for legal reform does not exist. As we are witnessing, when unleashed, this can take the state in unexpected directions. Any strategy for addressing women's demands must include a moral critique of institutions and the norms that uphold them. This would mean that freedom should not be assumed to exist in unbounded individualism, but freedom must be conceptualized as a place that is created and cultivated collectively. Thank you.
Absolutely brilliant and fantastic. Thank you so very much, Shirin. Really appreciate it. I could listen to you go on for hours, and so thank you for that really thought-provoking and thoughtful discussion. Let me just remind our audience that you can submit questions via the Q&A feature of Zoom or through the social media channels of the Arab Center. And those questions, both in English or Arabic, come to me, and then I'll pass them on to Professor Saeidi. May I just start? There's a couple of questions, but I just want to start out by asking if you could comment, if you comment on the role of the hijab in all of this, and in terms of particularly mandatory hijab as it's dictated by the government.
Thank you, Professor Kamrava. Well, I mean, I think, first of all, let me start here. I mean, Iranian women, I think there's a misconception that what is happening in Iran is, has never been seen in Iran or even in the region. I understand where that's coming from, and I'm sympathetic to that view. And I too, I'm very proud of everyone that's in the streets. But Iranian women have been at the forefront of every progressive movement since the early 1900s, not just as fighters, but as thinkers, as moral figures, as individuals and people that have strategies. And so, we can start from the early 1900s and come into 1979. I'll just focus on this period because that's what most people are interested in right now. But we have had, I mean, in terms of even organized women's movement, we've had the Million Signature Campaign, Stop Stoning Forever campaign, Mothers for Peace campaign. These are just a few that come to mind, and many more. So Iranian women have been at the forefront of politics, not just for physical autonomy and women's rights, but for everyone's rights, for a better society, for a very long time. In terms of the hijab, I mean, there's been, from the very beginning, mandatory hijab was a very controversial and contested notion. And women have fought with this, not just in the public sphere, but in the home. I think many people forget that, what we're seeing in the streets of Tehran and other parts of Iran today comes from women's lived experiences. It comes from having fathers and husbands and brothers that do not allow them to dress the way that they wish. And so this didn't happen overnight. This didn't happen because of one particular kind of leadership or campaign. This has been a collective, sustained struggle on different levels and layers, including from within the states, including from women who are elected officials in the Islamic Republic who have sided with women for some time now. So I think it's very important to keep this in mind. Now, I do want to add one thing that is also important because we're all academics. For a very long time, academics, and it's because we're operating, and many of us in the West, where there's a lot of Islamophobia, which is also very concerning to many of us right now as events are unfolding in Iran, and how we can, as Iranian feminists and scholars, how we can protect our fellow countrymen's movement from being hijacked by forces outside of the country. But because of these concerns about Islamophobia, a lot of academics chose not to discuss the mandatory hijab. And I remember when I was living in Iran and teaching at the University of Tehran and having relationships, loving relationships with non-elite women. So women that are not politically active, that are not academics, that don't think what we do is interesting. Talking to them, I just realized that, wow, their approaches and their kind of demands are very different from what we're talking about. And so I do think that organized feminist movements, and I don't want to place too much blame on them. I mean, we have to remember they were under intense surveillance, and many of these women escaped, for their life, or many of them are currently in prison still. But because of the different pressures and layers of pressure and emphasis on the state, I think the demands of women that fall outside of that community were sometimes not given a priority, but now we're seeing it. But again, I also think that hijab can, the Rusari can also be symbolic. I don't think that this is a women's-led movement that is only against patriarchy. I think it's against patriarchy, but I also feel that women are leading a national uprising against corruption, against mass arrest of activists and scholars, against censorship. So they're leading the movements. And so it's not, women can lead movements that are not just about issues pertaining to women. And I think that it's important to keep that in mind. See, and I said I wasn't going to even talk about this, but here we are talking about it.
Perfect, thank you. There's a question that asks about the Western media's portrayal of the protests, or at least implying that the current movement is largely middle and upper middle class, or upper class, led by women who come from well-off families. You mentioned this somewhat, but can you elaborate on the class diversity of those who are engaging in what's happening right now in Iran?
Thank you for that very important question. First thing I want to say is that I live in Fayetteville, Arkansas. I'm not in Tehran right now. Anything that I share with you is based on what I'm hearing from, friends and colleagues, and watching, like many others, on the news. So there's a lot of debate around how far the reach of the protests is. And I'm not so sure that, I'm not so sure that we can make that assessment right now. That would require years of research and fieldwork. There's probably very few people in the country that actually know right now what those dynamics are. Based on what I hear, it's serious. It's serious. I mean, it's slightly different than the times before. This is what I have heard from friends and family. And so to some extent, I mean, I'm not, you know, it's like when people say, you know, during the Aubon protests, there was more people in the streets. During 2009 uprising, there was like thousands of more. Now there's not as many. You know, I'm not so sure that those numbers matter. Every respected analyst within the country and outside of the country is saying that this is serious, which makes me think that there are, even if people are not in the street, again, it goes back to that. And again, this idea of the one spark comes from a very good colleague of mine who I'm writing a paper with based in Tehran. So I thank him for his, for being in conversation with me. It's the issue of that one spark. So maybe not everybody from Naziabad is in the streets, but it's just one spark away from everyone being in those streets, right? And so in that sense, I think it's important to listen and try to meet people's demands, you know, if you can, if you're in the country. I'm not so sure how significant it is, how many people are on the street or what particular class background. And I want to add, with the sanctions, you know, we don't talk about the sanctions and how part of the point of the sanctions was to bring the people into the streets as well. So that can't be overlooked. And so, yeah, no, I don't think that this is just wealthy children that are spoiled. Absolutely not.
Thank you. I don't want to take the conversation in a different direction, but you just mentioned something that I think is worth repeating. And you're familiar with Iranian academia. And one of the things you said is that probably in a few years we'll know the full extent of what's going on. And having studied Iran somewhat extensively over the last couple of years, I know and you know that Iranian academia has really reached a level that wasn't there, at least when I was growing up, and that survey research and in-depth field work in Iran by Iranian academics under rather difficult circumstances has become quite common. And it really is interesting that when you go and read some of the journal articles and books produced in Iran, how rich they are and rigorous in their arguments and methodologies and the research that has gone into them. So you're absolutely right. Probably in a few years, there will be a whole host of academic articles that explore what's going on in Iran today.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to add to that. That's why I think it's so important, because one thing I learned, I taught at the University of Tehran for 2 years. And one thing that I learned was that with all the problems that the universities in Iran have, they have professors that love their students and that really care about their country. So I think this is why they know. This is why when you read their work, it's revealing because it comes from love. And so I think that what we need to do is really follow their lead and to walk closely with them as they are leading and staying close to their students, sometimes physically protecting their students. The Iranian people know their society. They know, you know, what they're up against. And I really caution academics, journalists, and scholars to be careful about the words that they use, the language that they use. If ever in doubt, turn to feminists who, you know, have done this work in the country and are living abroad. I'm thinking of Mansoure Shojai, Susanna Tamasabadi, and many others who are very well skilled and versed at having complicated discussions across differences. And so it's true that people like myself, we study politics in Iran, we study gender politics, but you know, there's a saying that feminism is also the history of good intentions. And with good intentions, you can do a lot of harm. And so I'm afraid that good intentions alone are not enough to justify speaking on behalf of people who clearly, if they can stand in front of bullets, they can articulate their needs, and their demands. Just give them a few minutes to do that.
That's terrific. In some ways, you anticipated the question that came and answered it, but let me ask it anyway. There's a question that says you criticize the liberal feminism, but don't necessarily offer another perspective that women, either in the East or in Iran, can utilize, and one that can be used by academics against Western knowledge production. I'm not sure if I agree with the question, but could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, no, that's actually a very important question. Thank you. I think that it's important as Iranians for us to remember, like, we don't exist in the world alone. I know the media wants us to think that, like, there's no one else like us and that we're exceptional, but actually a lot of the questions that we're asking, a lot of the things that we're struggling with, other people in other parts of the world are also thinking about and struggling with. So one of the things that I'm really interested in these days is African American studies, Black feminist scholarship. They're talking about freedom. They're talking about the different ways that freedom is, conceptualized within their community. They are critiquing the global capitalist structures that unfortunately place some of our brothers and sisters in a position where they are throwing us into vans and harming us. So they're aware of those larger structures and they're critiquing those. They're aware of racism. They're aware of sexism. They're aware of extreme nationalism. Unfortunately, some of the slogans that we hear and some of the things that we even see repeated by scholars is very disturbing for the ways in which it's overlooking the centrality of racism globally, but also locally. So I would say, we need to read more broadly and think together.
Thank you. There's a question that asks you to elaborate on the extent to which economic dissatisfaction and economic conditions have fed what is currently happening. Let me add to that question by saying if you could elaborate on particularly women's economic empowerment or lack thereof in Iran. We know, for example, that Iran has probably, I think, the lowest level of female participation in the formal labor force in the Middle East. At a time when, as you mentioned, an overwhelming majority of women in universities and among university graduates are female. So can you comment on the general economic conditions and how they feed into this, and particularly on women's position in Iran, in the Iranian economy, either in the formal or informal sectors?
Yeah, I mean, I was speaking with a friend of mine about this, and she's from Iran and she grew up in Iran, and she said to me, and I want to just remember her words because I think they're so accurate. She said, do you know why it is that women are leading this? Of course, we know all of the history and all the different things, right? But she said, there's something else. And I said, what is it? And she said, well, it's the women are oftentimes, they do carry all of the pressure of the sanctions. When that husband, for instance, comes home and he's not able to provide and he's not in a good place emotionally, it's the woman that pays for that. She faces the repercussions of that. When there's not food on the table, it's the woman that has to find a way to kind of divide the food for it to reach everyone. When there's not enough money, it's the women, historically, it's the women in the community and in the family that have to find a way to prepare a young man or a young woman for marriage. And so women are facing, and if you want to read more about this, I really recommend the work of Nicola Pratt and Nadia Al-Ali on Iraq and sanctions. So it is absolutely women who bear the most difficult parts of what is happening. We absolutely, for me, any kind of transnational solidarity and transnational work that does not include us screaming at the top of our voice for the sanctions to end is not enough. It's simply not enough, because the women are the ones that are paying the highest price for the sanctions. And I think that's that's at least a contributing reason for why we see them in the streets. It's also one of the reasons that so many activists and journalists and Iranians are upset with this kind of narrative that, and coming from the United States, that we care about the women of Iran. No, well, you don't. I mean, you don't. You pulled out of the nuclear energy negotiation. You added more sanctions. And so you don't. And so I think it's important for us to have this historical memory, to speak bravely, and to not put ourselves in a position where we have to pick one side or the other, and to keep an eye on all of the moving parts, as you rightly are suggesting, Professor Komrava.
Perfect, thank you. There's a question, you've answered it in multiple ways, but because it's asked and to ensure that the person asking it gets a hearing, is Mahsa's hair going to break the back of the Islamic Republic?
Again,
so sorry for interrupting. One analogy that's often used is in the same way that Mohammad Bouazizi's tragic death led to the Arab Spring. Mahsa Amini's tragic death, will this be an Iranian Arab Spring?
Again, I feel like I just don't think about those kinds of questions, and I don't ask those kinds of questions. I think that, as so many of my wonderful, the younger generation of Iranian studies scholars have been saying on their social media, they've been so active. I mean, the revolution is already happened. If we understand revolution to mean all Iranians from different walks of life standing next to one another and defending a woman's right to physical autonomy, the revolution has already happened. Again, as the state for me also is just not the main focus of how I think about social and political life. So we'll have to wait and see. I mean, I don't know. I can't really predict the future.
Professor Saeidi, you've been so terrific and so generous with your knowledge and insights. I sincerely hope you accept our invitation again and come back in a year or in a few months and again share your insights with us at that point. I very much appreciate it. With that, I will bring this session to a close. I thank our audience worldwide, and I particularly thank Professor Shirin Saeidi for giving us so much food for thought and for sharing her wonderful insights and knowledge with us. Thank you, Professor Saeidi, and my sincere thanks to everyone here in Doha and around the world.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening to you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.